They called him a nobody. They laughed at his uniform, mocked his silence, and walked past him like he didn't exist. But tonight, the janitor was about to unlock a door no one else dared touch. And when he did, the entire company would never look at him the same way again. Frank Harris had learned to live with being invisible. Every day for 15 years, he pushed his cleaning cart down the polished halls of Sterling Industries, head down, eyes low, and mouth shut. The suits didn't see him. Not really. He was background noise, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the squeak of the mop, the quiet man who made their mess disappear while they bragged about deals worth more than he'd make in a lifetime. But this morning, something changed. It wasn't just the usual snickers or the fake, "Thanks, buddy," from men in $1,000 shoes. No. This time, they laughed. Not at a joke. Not at a story. At him. "Hey, Frankie the floor guy," one of the junior execs called out, holding up a wadded piece of paper like bait. "You missed this." The paper hit the ground. The laughter followed. Frank froze, his mop still in hand, staring at the crumpled ball at his feet. His chest burned, but his face didn't move. Not an inch. Because Frank Harris wasn't just a janitor. Not really. He was something else entirely. And tonight, they'd all find out. The day crawled by. Phones rang. Deals closed. Money poured through Sterling Industries like water through a busted dam. And Frank? Frank mopped. He polished. He emptied trash cans and swept floors and nodded politely when someone brushed past him. Without a glance. But behind his calm face, behind those tired eyes, something was shifting. When the building finally emptied and the last suit strutted out with his leather briefcase, Frank didn't go home. He didn't clock out. Instead, he pushed his cart past the break room, past the elevators, all the way to the top floor. The executive floor. The place where people like him weren't even allowed to breathe too loud. And there, at the very end of the hall, was the door. The CEO's office. Locked. For everyone else. But not for him. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. Not the plastic security badges the suits carried. No. This was old. Brass. Heavy. A relic from a time when Sterling Industries was still just a handful of offices and one man sitting behind a wooden desk. That man had given Frank this key. And Frank had never used it. Until now. Click. The sound was small but thunderous in the silence. Frank pushed the door open. Inside, the office looked untouched by time. The oak desk. The leather chairs. The towering bookshelves lined with ledgers instead of laptops. And on the far wall, a single portrait. The founder. Frank stepped inside, his footsteps soft against the carpet. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He just nodded at the portrait. "Evening, boss," he muttered. And then he walked to the desk, crouched down, and pressed his hand against the underside. There. A latch. He opened it. A hidden compartment slid out with a dull scrape. Inside was a file. Thick. Heavy. Yellowed with age. On the front, in faded black ink, "Confidential, eyes only." Frank's fingers trembled. This was it. He opened the file. Page after page of numbers. Names. Signatures. Offshore accounts. Wire transfers that could sink governments. And there, at the very bottom, Richard Hale. The CEO. The same man who called Frank the floor mop. Frank's lips curved into the smallest, coldest smile. He knew what he was holding. He knew what it meant. And for the first time in 15 years, Frank Harris felt taller than every suit in this building. The next morning, the laughter started early. "Morning, Frankie," one of the execs called out, tossing an empty coffee cup toward the trash can, and missing. Frank didn't move. He didn't pick it up. He just pushed his cart forward. Because at 9 a.m., he wasn't going to be invisible anymore. When he reached the CEO's office, Richard Hale was already inside, leaning back in his $1,000 chair, scrolling through his phone like a king on his throne. "Frank," Hale said, not even glancing up. "Close the door when you leave. And don't touch anything." Frank didn't move. Instead, he walked up to the desk and placed an envelope on it. Richard frowned, finally looking up. "What's this?" Frank didn't answer. He didn't have to. Richard opened the envelope. and then the color drained from his face. He looked up. "You." Frank leaned closer. "Guess who's laughing now?" he whispered. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Richard Hale smiled. Not the smile of a man who's beaten. The smile of a man holding cards no one else can see. "Frank," he said quietly. "You really think you're the only one who knows about this?" Frank froze. Because in Richard's hand wasn't the file. It was a key. Just like his. And then Richard leaned back and said 5 words that made Frank's blood run cold. "You're not the only one." Frank stared at him. Richard's grin only widened. "See, you were never supposed to find this," Richard said. "But since you did, I guess I should let you in on a little secret." He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a second file. Thicker, heavier, and stamped across the front, in red ink, "Harris." Frank's hands curled into fists. Because that wasn't his boss's handwriting. That was his. From a lifetime ago. A lifetime he thought he'd buried. Richard leaned forward, eyes sharp and cold. "You walk out that door, or I open this file." Frank's jaw tightened. He had spent 15 years hiding in plain sight. 15 years of silence. 15 years trying to forget. And now the man who mocked him, belittled him, and treated him like dirt, was about to burn his entire world to the ground. Unless Frank burned his first. He didn't speak. Not yet. He just turned, pushed his cart to the door, and paused with his hand on the handle. "I'm not the same man I was," Frank said quietly. Richard chuckled. "We'll see." Frank looked over his shoulder. And for the first time in 15 years, he smiled. Not the small, tired smile of a janitor. But the dangerous smile of a man with nothing left to lose. "See you tonight," Frank said. And then he left. Richard stared after him, still grinning. Because whatever was coming next was going to burn this entire building to the ground. And neither man was planning to lose. Frank Harris didn't leave the CEO's office that night. He couldn't. For years, they laughed at him. The janitor. The nobody. The man who mopped their floors while they stepped over him like a stain. But tonight, he was holding the founder's brass key. And that key had just opened a door Richard Hale, the mighty CEO, never wanted anyone to see. Inside was everything. Bank records. Shell companies. Hidden slush funds. And one file labeled only with 3 words, "Legacy Account Access." Frank sat there, his tired hands trembling as he scrolled through the documents. This wasn't just money. This was power. And for the first time in his life, it belonged to him. The building was silent. The city outside, sleeping. But Frank was wide awake. He saw the faces of every executive who ever laughed at him. Every security guard who told him to stay in his lane. Every manager who called him background. And now? He was about to erase every single one of them. At 2:14 a.m., Frank started typing. No fancy words. No threats. Just one email. Attached was the file. Every scandal. Every secret. And one video from the founder himself, recorded decades ago, like a time bomb waiting for Frank to set it off. The founder's voice cracked through the speakers, calm but sharp as steel. "If you're watching this, it means the company has lost its way. That's why I left this key. For the man who never asked for power, but earned it anyway." Frank didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply hit send. And then, for the first time in 15 years, he walked out of that office with his head held high. By sunrise, the world was on fire. The file had hit every inbox in the company. Board members. Employees. Reporters. Regulators. And Richard Hale? He was still asleep in his penthouse. But when he woke up, his empire was already crumbling. At 8:47 a.m., the lobby of Sterling Industries looked like a war zone. Reporters crowded the entrance. Cameras flashed. Security scrambled. And then Richard Hale stormed in, his $1,000 suit pressed, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. "Clear a path," he barked. But nobody moved. Security stepped forward. "Sir, we're going to need your badge." The look on Hale's face? Priceless. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he snapped. The guard didn't blink. "Yeah. That's the problem." And just like that, the cameras caught it. The world's most untouchable CEO, frozen in place. By 9:30 a.m., the board of directors held an emergency meeting. Hale was locked in a conference room, screaming into a phone that nobody answered. And Frank? Frank was in the janitor's closet, leaning on his mop, listening to the sound of a kingdom collapsing. When the board finally voted, it wasn't even close. Unanimous. Richard Hale, fired. And within hours, federal agents were at the building. The same man who once mocked Frank for not knowing his place was now escorted out in handcuffs, while every employee watched. When Frank walked through the lobby that morning, something happened he never expected. People moved. They didn't push past him. They didn't pretend he wasn't there. They stepped aside. And they looked at him. One reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Mr. Harris, how does it feel to bring down the CEO of Sterling Industries?" Frank paused. And for the first time, his voice didn't shake. "Just doing my job," he said. And the lobby erupted with flashes, questions, and whispers. The janitor who nobody noticed had just brought down a king. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. The janitor who took down a titan. One man, one key, one reckoning. But Frank didn't care about the press. He cared about one thing. Walking into work, pushing his cart, and watching every single suit in that building step out of his way. He didn't need a title. He didn't need applause. He had something better. Respect. A week later, the board called Frank into the CEO's office. They offered him a new job. An office. A title. Frank laughed. "I'm not here for titles," he said. "I'll keep these floors clean. You just keep this company clean." And for the first time, the board didn't laugh. They nodded. Because in a building full of power, the only man who didn't want any of it was the one man who deserved it most. That night, Frank Harris mopped the floors of Sterling Industries one last time as the sun set over the glass towers. But this time, no one walked past him. They didn't see the janitor. They saw the man who made the powerful bleed. And for Frank Harris, that was enough. They laughed at him. They ignored him. They thought he was just the janitor. Until the day he turned the key and unlocked the truth. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, your subscription isn't just a button. It's a voice. Because every time you subscribe, it helps us share more powerful stories. Stories they'd rather keep hidden. Hit subscribe. Because the louder we get, the harder it is for them to silence us.